A lot of people in the comic book industry will talk about the amazing growth in comic book sales that have been going on the last few years. In fact, 2021 had the largest growth in comic book sales in the history of the industry. A lot of people like to say that the comic book industry, when we're talking about like the big two Western comic books, is doing fine. But when you look at the numbers, and we have a breakdown from Brian Hibbs, he's a comic book retailer from San Francisco. He's certainly not anti-DC or Marvel. These are his breakdowns of the NPD Bookscan numbers. If you don't know what those are sales of graphic novels. Those are in bookstores. So we're not really talking about floppy comics. We're not really talking about the direct market. But almost all of this amazing growth that we're experiencing right now in comic books is in the bookstore channel. So these numbers are very important. And when you get to these numbers and you look at them, we're going to start with the big picture, the entire comic industry as far as sales, and we're going to break it down to the top 20. Then we're going to go to Western comics. We're going to cut out the manga numbers, and then we'll finally get to DC and Marvel. If you're a DC or Marvel marketer or somebody that's in charge of sales, you should be throwing up in your mouth right now. These numbers are ghastly. DC set a record for the lowest number of books they've ever had in the top 750 book channel sales in the history of these reports, which is about 20 years old. Marvel, for the first time ever, had nothing show up in the top 750. When you see some of the titles that are actually outselling everything Marvel produces, some of them, in fact, are featuring Marvel characters, but not from Marvel themselves. If you're at Marvel Comics, you should not feel comfortable with your job right now. Essentially, what DC and Marvel have done is they've given up on kids. There are almost no DC or Marvel comics out right now that are appropriate for children that you would want to give to them. And the ones that do seem like it, there's always some weird kind of agenda pushed in there. And a lot of that you see on the DC YA graphic novels. You're like, who is I Am Not Starfire for? Shockingly, it didn't crack the top 750, although I bet it sells better than anything probably Marvel produces right now. Their numbers are just mind-blowing. But the fact that DC and Marvel just essentially gave up their core audience in the 90s and decided to grow up with their audience and decided that they were going to sell their comic books at higher prices on the idea that these were collectibles and no longer entertainment. And they left an entire generation of readers behind. But guess what? There are new comic readers. There are a ton of new comic readers. They're just not going to be reading DC and Marvel. Dogman is not a gateway drug to DC or Marvel comics. That's not a gateway to Spider-Man. That's not a gateway to Batman. They've completely shut off a channel for new readers, and these readers are going to grow up, and a lot of them are going to continue reading comic books, but they aren't going to be reading DC and Marvel. DC and Marvel, with their strategies over the last 20, 30 years, have probably doomed themselves to be completely irrelevant. They are no longer the big two. It's kind of like what Perch said. They're indie comics now, and you'll see a lot of those indie publishers that they're destroying in floppy comic sales are absolutely blasting them in graphic novel sales, especially Marvel. So let's get into the numbers. These are from Brian Hibbs, the retailer from San Francisco, from his Tilting at Windmills newsletter that he produces and I think gets distributed on ComicsBeat. As a reminder, all sales reported in this video are from the NPD group, which runs NPD Bookscan. These reflect actual sales made through bookstores that report to NPD, which includes Amazon. NPD believes that some 85% or more comic book sales are captured in these numbers. So they're actually probably a little bit light in some cases. And these are sales to customers. These aren't sales to the bookstore. These are sales directly to the customers. These are books in hand. Now let's get to the overall numbers. 2022 Bookscan analysis reveals the largest growth we have ever seen in the top 750, with more comics material sold in 2021 than 2018 and 2019 combined. The trend for book prints in general, not just looking at comics, through bookstores in 2021, according to NPD Group and NPD Bookscan, appears to be a general rise of 8.9% in 2021, which does nothing but continue the now 8-year trend of comics material being significantly stronger than the general curve. Comic sales within these channels is actually well up, over 60%, almost 70% in total. Definitely outpacing anything out there. You will not see anything from DC or Marvel show up in these top scale numbers. There's only a few of them that even show up in the top 750. Nothing for Marvel. It's absolutely insane how this is being dominated by Scholastic and manga. Almost everything in the top 150 is geared towards children. Or if it's not, it's manga. If you cut out all the manga stuff, It cuts it down to about half the titles, 75. Only 3 of them weren't geared towards children. Almost everything in the Western market that is hot right now is geared towards kids and teens. That is not DC or Marvel's audience. They let them go years ago, and they found new materials to fill their customer needs from Manga, Scholastic, and a lot of other publishers. When you look at the top 20 sales, 17 of the top 20 are intended for children or middle readers. 4 of the top 20 are manga. And if you are looking for a DC Marvel style comic, you are not even in the top 150. In fact, the first DC comic appears at 164, and former best-selling Watchmen not showing up until number 250. As for Marvel, their very first appearance isn't until all the way down at 892 with Infinity Gauntlet. This means Scholastic's Miles Morales Shockwaves radically outperforms any published by Marvel comic, coming in at number 202. In fact, 42,000 copies of Scholastic's Miles Morales Shockwaves, which sells roughly 4 times better than any other Marvel graphic novel published by Marvel, and in fact, more than 10 times better than Marvel's own Miles Morales bestseller, Spider-Verse Miles Morales. Absolutely shocking. No Marvel in the top 750, just a few DC comics, nothing piercing the top 150. And I can tell you, as a father that has boys that read comic books, they don't like DC and Marvel right now. There are a couple of DC books that I can get my son to read. First up, he likes Superman and Smallville. I don't think they make anything like this on the market right now. If they do, they don't promote it at all. The other thing that he likes from DC is this book here, Tiny Titans. They haven't made any of these in a very long time, but these are absolutely fantastic. I tried to give him some Marvel stuff. This is the best I could find. Captain America. He loves Captain America. He won't read that. I gave him this Star Wars book, Adventures from IDW. He doesn't like that one either. But when I got him this is when I got him for Christmas, the Dogman Super Extra Epic Collection. He has read every one of these books. There's 6 of them, and he's read them multiple times. 6 years old. This is all he wants to read, and he doesn't really want to read much DC or Marvel right now. He loves Marvel characters because he really likes cartoons. He loves the action figures. He'll watch the MCU a little bit with me from time to time, but he's a Dogman guy. They have nothing suited for children. And the things that they did have, like Super Sons, and they did have Teen Titans Go, which really isn't for 6-year-olds, to be completely honest, but they've discontinued those. And then if you go to their graphic novels that they're trying to sell to kids, there's a lot of weird messaging in there. And I won't let my children read those books. Dogman is an absolute must-have. In a house like this where I have kids that read comic books, they won't touch anything really DC or Marvel. It's very few and far between. And the stuff they will read, the 6-year-old specifically, is out of, they don't make it anymore. They've decided to not run with that stuff. Huge blunders on the part of DC Comics. Marvel Comics isn't even in the game. I don't even know what the hell they're doing. As far as the overall performance of Western comic books, it is now the 7th year in a row that the #1 Western publisher in NPD Bookscan top 750 is Scholastic, given that they only started doing comics in 2005. And in that time, they grow past 40% of the market with under 450 SKUs. Within the top 750, Scholastic sells a staggering 9.4 million copies from 83 placing books. They sold 6.9 million books last year in total, and that includes books outside the top 750 last year. If you combine the top 750 performance of all the traditional direct market premier publishers, Boom, Dark Horse, DC Comics, Dynamite, IDW, Image, and Marvel Comics, those combined bestsellers only amount to under 970,000 books together, or barely a tenth of what Scholastic does alone. They've completely lost the future of the market. They've ceded it over to Scholastic, which will in turn move them on to other books that aren't DC and Marvel, or Image, or Boom. Now, Dark Horse certainly has a future because they have a lot of manga sales, and I'm not going to go into the manga sales now, but Dark Horse is absolutely a player on the manga scene because of Berserk. DC and Marvel have a problem. They are not performing against their peers. If they want their peers to be the comic book industry and they want to be a part of all this growth, they aren't a part of it. It's manga, it's Scholastic, it's other publishers like that. In fact, if you look at the next top 5 publishers, the top 5 are Scholastic, HarperCollins, Penguin Random House. That's not including the Marvel stuff because they just distribute. That's not their actual books. They don't publish them. Holzbrink and Andrews McNeil, those make up the top 5 publishers for comic books in bookstores by volume. DC has always performed traditionally better than Marvel on the graphic novel scene. As far as DC goes, they are in fact the number 6 publisher in the top 750. As I mentioned, DC spent a really long time as the number 1 Western publisher before losing to Scholastic and was at least number 2 until 2018. In 2021, DC has no books over 50,000 sales, only 8 over 20,000, and 14 or more coming in over 10,000. DC is placing the lowest number of books in the top 750 it ever has. In 2021, they placed just 17 titles in the top 750, about half of a mere 2 years ago, for 396,000 units and $8.3 million in calculated retail price. DC's number 1 book via NPD Bookscan reports in 2021 is YA Teen Titans Beast Boy by Kami Garcia, which sold 48,000 copies. The same writer has the number 2 book, Teen Titans Beast Boy Loves Raven, as well as the number 7 book with Teen Titans Raven. Coming in at number 3 is Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. How long ago was that published? Nearly 34,000 copies sold. This is a pretty big drop from last year when it was 52,000. Alan Moore's Batman the Killing Joke comes in at DC's number 10 book with 19,000. And the final book of Alan Moore's that sold over 10,000 copies is V for Vendetta. At number 4 for DC Comics is the first comic featuring Batman. Although he's not actually the prime selling point of that book, it would be Batman Fortnite 0.28,000. There are a ton of Bat-related books selling well for DC, including Batman Who Laughs in paperback at number 6, hardcover at number 16, Batman 3 Jokers came in at number 8, Batman Year 1 at number 11, Long Halloween at number 12, Harleen number 14, and Batman Last Night on Earth number 17. And while they didn't make the top 750, DC also did well with Batman White Knight selling over 12,000 copies and Batman Joker War selling over 11,000 copies. And those would be 19 and 20 bestsellers for DC respectively. DC is doing much better than Marvel, but they're not doing anywhere what they were in the past. They've absolutely made themselves irrelevant. They're reliant too much on Batman. They gave up their young audience. They're selling more copies of Kami Garcia's Teen Titans Beast Boy book than they can anything else, at least in book channels. Perhaps they should go and invest in some better writers than Kami Garcia and give them some of their prime characters. We know Gotham High just didn't work out. I wonder why that Batman book just didn't resonate with children. DC Comics needs a clear, coherent strategy for their graphic novels aimed at YA audiences, but they need to also have floppies coming out for children for them to go get those as well. That will lead them into the DC Comics aisle when they get older and perhaps the direct market. There's no future for DC Comics with what they're doing right now. At least Marvel has the movies, the cartoons, and theme parks and stuff. DC isn't even hitting on that stuff. As far as rounding out the top 10 Western publishers, we have Dark Horse, Henry and Abrams, Hachette, and IDW. When you get to Marvel Comics numbers, these are even worse. For the first time ever, Marvel has 0 books within the top 750. 2 other publishers, Scholastic and IDW, each place a book licensed from Marvel into the top 750, showing there is demand for Marvel products in the bookstore market. Marvel is literally synonymous with the very idea of comics for a meaningful percentage of American population, and they also have Star Wars. I did enjoy this anecdote from Brian Hibbs, so I'm going to leave it in here. I thought this was funny. I remember 20 years ago to this month when then Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada gave an interview to The Observer where he said this about DC, quote, "I mean, they have Batman and Superman, and they don't know what to do with them. That's like being a porn star with the biggest dick, and you can't get it up," unquote. And with tiny little IDW able to sell more copies of Marvel-branded product into bookstores than Marvel, it appears that Marvel is the one who needs Viagra. Very well said, Mr. Hibbs. Now, keep this in mind about what Marvel's doing right now. Since 2007, the overall size of the bookstore market has more than tripled, from 15.3 million books sold to 51.8 million books. While in that same period, Marvel is now selling 4,000 fewer books with nearly 4 times the SKUs in the market. Meanwhile, DC is selling 60% more books than Marvel. So the next time you go out there and you say, hey, DC and Marvel aren't doing so well, and they go, listen, we have the biggest growth in the history of the market, no matter how you look at it. No, there's a way to look at it. And DC has a place and Marvel has a place. And they aren't a part of the growth. Specifically Marvel. They don't even have a book in the top 750. DC was the number 1 publisher of Western comic books being sold in bookstores until 2015. They were number 2 until 2018. So not that long ago. Now they're not even in the top 5. If you took all of the companies that are the premier comic book publishers in the direct market and you combine their sales, it's just 10% of what Scholastic does with their sales in the top 750. They have a problem. It's an enormous problem. This is terrifying. If you work at DC and Marvel and you see this, and this doesn't shake you to your core, and then you don't see that perhaps there's no future in the comic book industry for you, that you may be irrelevant very soon, that you're no longer the big two. You're the indie scene. The big two are Scholastic and Manga, and they are eating your lunch every single day. Hey, the direct market may have stabilized, and perhaps there's even a little bit of growth going on there. All the growth, a ton of money is being made in comic books. An entire generation of new readers are coming in through bookstores. And DC and Marvel, they aren't even a part of the game anymore. Absolutely terrified. But we've seen this stuff coming. Not that long ago, I think it was a couple years ago, I talked to my good friend Aaron Sparrow, and we talked about how Marvel and DC were hearing from their fans, and they were telling them what they wanted, and they never listened to them. Definitely check out this conversation, because these aren't new problems. These problems are just being exacerbated by the morons at DC and Marvel. It's only going to get worse, folks.